Nervous system. Section A, Intro to the nervous system.
The nervous system is like the control booth for your entire body. Every time you swat at a bee, every time you think poorly of your enemies, every time you eat a gummy animal and say to yourself, by God, that's a delicious gummy animal. It all begins with your nervous system.
Am I being charged for this?
Yes. Now, the nervous system is made up of two distinct parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system.
The central nervous system, or CNS, is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain acts as a command center, sending messages to the body. The spinal cord acts as a courier and carries these messages. Basically, the CNS takes incoming sensory information. You know, stuff you hear, taste, and see. The CNS receives that stimuli, interprets it, and then responds to it.
The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, consists of structures outside the central nervous system, nerves that extend from and insert into the brain and spinal cord. Basically, the peripheral nervous system links the body to the central nervous system. We'll go into detail on both these systems in just a little bit.
In order to completely understand the nervous system, you have to learn about the minuscule building blocks of nervous tissue. There are two types of building blocks called neurons and supporting cells.
Neurons are the tiny structural units that make up the nervous system. They are specialized cells that conduct messages in the form of electrochemical waves called action potentials. Because we're talking about anatomy and not physiology, you don't really have to learn much about impulses and action potentials. Just know they exist.
Also, remember that most mature neurons can't undergo mitosis, meaning they can't reproduce. That means they can't be replaced if they're destroyed. So be careful. Brain damage is irreversible.
Neurons are large complex cells made up of a cell body with outreaching extensions, or processes. The cell body is like a base, an anchor for all the extensions. Every neuron has two different types of cell extensions coming out of its cell body. These extensions are the axon and the dendrites.
The axon is a single extension which can vary in length. The axon conducts impulses away from the cell body of a neuron and towards other cells. Dendrites are short, thick, branched extensions of the cell body. The dendrites receive and conduct signals toward the cell body. So, while the axons conduct impulses away from the cell body, the dendrites conduct impulses towards the cell body.
Now, the supporting cells are a whole different can of worms. The supporting cells are different from neurons. First off, the supporting cells are non-excitable, meaning they do not conduct impulses. Also, there's a lot more supporting cells in the body than neurons. In fact, there are 9 times more supporting cells than neurons. Yep, these babies comprise the bulk of nervous tissue, so they're real important. They basically support the neurons. If neurons are golfers, supporting cells are caddies. There are 6 types of supporting cells. 4 of them are in the central nervous system, and 2 of them are in the peripheral nervous system.
The 4 types of supporting cells of the CNS are called neuroglia, meaning nerve glue. There are 4 kinds of neuroglia. They are astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal cells, and microglia.
Astrocytes are the most common neuroglia. They're star-shaped, which should be easy to remember, because astro should remind you of outer space. The astrocyte's main job is to brace neurons and link them to blood capillaries, which are the neuron's main source of nutrients. Oligodendrocytes are another type of neuroglia. Now, oligodendrocytes is a huge, complex word, but actual oligodendrocytes aren't that complex. In fact, they have even fewer branches than astrocytes. The main job of oligodendrocytes is to insulate neurons. They accomplish this by wrapping their cytoplasmic extensions around the neurons to create a protective covering. This protective covering made up of oligodendrocytes is called the myelin sheath. We'll go into more detail on the myelin sheath later.
The microglia are small, sort of oval-shaped cells with long, thorny extensions sticking out of them. Their main job is to protect the central nervous system by attacking and engulfing invading microorganisms.
The ependymal cells are the last type of neuroglia in the central nervous system. These cells are shaped like columns and have tiny little fibrous extensions coming off them. The flipping and flopping of these extensions helps circulate the cerebrospinal fluid, which is liquid stuff that helps cushion the brain and spinal cord. But don't worry, we'll go into more detail on the spinal cord, brain, and cerebrospinal fluid later.
The neuroglia, unlike neurons, can reproduce. Great, right?
Right.
Wrong. These cells are the cells that, when they divide too much, produce brain tumors and cancers known as gliomas.
Bummer.
Yeah, but don't worry. When neuroglia reproduce at a normal rate, they're fine. So don't dwell on it. Just commit the 4 different types of neuroglia to memory and then move on to the supporting cells in the peripheral nervous system.
There are 2 different kinds of supporting cells in the peripheral nervous system: satellite cells and Schwann cells.
The satellite cells surround a neuron cell body and play a role in controlling its chemical environment.
The Schwann cells are the peripheral nervous system's version of the CNS's oligodendrocytes. Remember them? They're one of the 4 neuroglia. You remember how oligodendrocytes make up the myelin sheaths in the central nervous system? Well, Schwann cells do the same thing for the PNS. Just like oligodendrocytes, Schwann cells insulate the axons of neurons. When you put all of the Schwann cells together, the total sheath of insulation you create is called a myelin sheath. The myelin sheath increases the speed of an impulse traveling along the axon, kind of like how plastic insulation increases the speed of electricity through a wire.
If for some reason the myelin sheath is destroyed, impulse conduction deteriorates. This is called demyelination. This sort of deterioration occurs in demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis.
Well, you've had a brief introduction to the building blocks of the nervous tissue. Now you can concentrate on learning about the anatomy of the 2 major parts of the nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system.
Section B, the central nervous system.
As you remember, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. We'll discuss the brain first.
Can I go home now?
Hey, who's the doctor?
Anatomists argue all the time about how to divide the brain up in order to name it. Well, you can argue from today till tomorrow, but no matter how you divide the brain up, the major structures within the brain remain the same. So for the sake of convenience, we've divided the brain into 4 major regions: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum.
The cerebrum forms the superior or upper part of the brain and accounts for about 80% of total brain mass.
That's a lot of brains.
The cerebrum is highly convoluted. This means it has tons of folds and curves. These folds and curves are made up of elevated ridges of tissue called gyri and shallow grooves called sulci. One of the major areas of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex.
The cerebral cortex is a thin layer that covers the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex is made up of something called gray matter. Gray matter is made up of cell bodies and unmyelinated fibers. Remember, unmyelinated means no myelin sheath. The inner area of the cerebrum is made up of myelinated axons called white matter. But within this white matter, there's also little islands of gray matter called basal nuclei.
The cerebrum is divided into a right and left hemisphere. Then each hemisphere is subdivided into 5 lobes. 4 of those lobes are named for the cranial bones that are located right above them. These lobes are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. The 5th lobe is buried within the other lobes and is called the insula. So there are 5 lobes per hemisphere.
These cerebral lobes are responsible for our conscious behavior. First off, they're responsible for cognitive functions. You know, higher thinking like language and memory. These lobes also interpret stimuli and help us produce appropriate responses. This means that these lobes help us do things like read, write, and figure out how to build and defuse non-lethal bombs. Basically, without our cerebrum, we'd be worthless lumps, with no language skills, incapable of appropriate responses.
The next major part of the brain is called the diencephalon. Though the word diencephalon sounds like a dangerous space weapon or Greek deity, in actuality, it is a dangerous space weapon. Actually, it's the core of the brain and is surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres. It consists of 3 regions: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. All of these regions surround the 3rd ventricle, one of several fluid-filled cavities inside the brain, which is also known as a dangerous space weapon.
The epithalamus makes up the roof of the 3rd ventricle. It might be helpful to remember that the prefix epi means upon. The hypothalamus provides the floor of the 3rd ventricle, and funnily enough, hypo means below. And finally, the 3rd ventricle is entirely surrounded by the thalamus. So without these other structures, the 3rd ventricle wouldn't be a cavity at all.
The thalamus is a solid egg-shaped structure that makes up about 80% of the total mass of the diencephalon, so you could say it's pretty big. The thalamus serves as a sensory relay station to the cerebral cortex. Without it, our 5 senses would be useless.
The epithalamus is posterior to the thalamus. It's involved in the regulation of the sleep-wake cycle because it contains the pineal gland, which produces the hormone melatonin. You'll learn more about hormones in the Anatomically Correct World of Anatomy Part 2. And don't forget, the epithalamus also makes up the roof of the third ventricle. But you know that.
The hypothalamus is just below the thalamus, and surprise, surprise, it forms the floor of the third ventricle.
Is the hypothalamus important? Well, why don't you be the judge? The hypothalamus is responsible for controlling the autonomic nervous system, which we'll talk more about later. This means that the hypothalamus indirectly regulates heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, digestion, hormone release, hunger, thirst, emotions, and the libido, or sex drive.
It's pretty obvious that the hypothalamus, as well as its friends, the thalamus and the epithalamus, are important.
And so I say to the guy, goiter, I thought you said loiter. You be still. The brainstem is the next major region of the brain. It's located between the spinal cord and the diencephalon.
Can I have a piece of bread?
The brainstem helps out by controlling the heart rate and respiratory rates. It also houses the visual and auditory reflex centers that help us see and hear. It's even connected to 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we'll give you the details on later.
The brainstem is made up of 3 different regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata.
The midbrain is a short area located directly below the diencephalon, which you just learned about. The pons, meaning bridge, is inferior to or below the midbrain. And finally, the medulla oblongata is the section of the brainstem that is furthest down and blends into the spinal cord at the base of the skull. It also makes a great song lyric.
Medulla oblongata, Mr. Robota.
The cerebellum is the last major region of the brain we'll talk about. It's also the name of the company that produced this video, Cerebellum Corporation. The location and function of the cerebellum is best described in this commercial for our company, Cerebellum Corporation.
Cerebellum, helping you help yourself.
I founded Cerebellum when I was 8 years old. It was a dream of mine. I decided to name the company Cerebellum because cerebellum means little brain. Our company is a little brain with a big dream.
The cerebellum is located dorsally or behind the pons and the medulla and separated into 2 hemispheres. Our building is located dorsally to a liquor store and separated into 2 warehouses. The similarities are pretty obvious.
The cerebellum is responsible for motor coordination, posture, and balance. All of the writers at Cerebellum are very balanced.
You ever dream you have claws?
There are countless similarities between the real cerebellum and our company. It's really pretty astounding.
Cerebellum, helping you help yourself.
It's what we do.
So that's the skinny on the cerebellum. It's located behind or dorsally to the pons and medulla oblongata. It's also responsible for motor coordination and balance.
You might also want to take a look at a structure that's contained inside the cerebellum called the arbor vitae. If you make a sagittal cut through the cerebellum, which is a vertical cut that divides it into 2 halves, you'll see a bunch of white branches.
These white branches are extensions of the myelinated axons in the white matter of the brain. The patterns these extensions make are called the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae means tree of life, but only its really close friends call it that.
Oh, there's one more tricky thing you should learn about the cerebellum. Even though the word cerebellum means little brain, the cerebellum actually makes up 11% of the total brain mass. It's the 2nd largest region in the brain after the cerebrum. So commit that to memory and you'll know all you need to know about the brain. The cerebellum, the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem, they work together in perfect harmony.
Are you telling us that a structure as vastly complex and delicate as the brain has no form of protection?
Okay, you caught us again. The brain does have 3 forms of protection: the skull, the meninges, and a liquid cushion called cerebrospinal fluid. Now, we've already discussed the skull, but the meninges and cerebrospinal fluid are fair game. The meninges are made up of 3 connective tissue membranes. These membranes cover and protect the structures in the central nervous system. You know, the brain and the spinal cord. The 3 meningeal layers, from the outermost one to the innermost one, are the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater.
Just like the land of the free, the brain needs protection. And these 3 meningeal layers we have are perfect for the job. And so, I give you the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The dura mater, translated it means tough mother, and what a tough mother it is. It's leathery, double-layered, and surrounds the entire brain. It also anchors the brain to the skull to limit movement. The dura mater, without it, the brain would be as defenseless as the Swiss.
Qu'est-ce que c'est avec vous? Laissez-nous tranquilles.
The arachnoid is the middle membrane. It's made up of loose connective tissue membrane and contains web-like extensions. That's how it gets its name. It's spidery, web-like, and wily. Without it, the brain would be as defenseless as the Canadians.
Oh, knock it off, eh?
The pia mater is known as the gentle mother. The pia mater is the innermost layer. It is heavily invested with small blood vessels and clings to the brain's surface. It is very dainty and delicate. The pia mater has no business being in the army.
Cerebrospinal fluid also protects the brain and is amusingly nicknamed CSF. CSF is a fluid found inside ventricles, which are cavities in the brain. It's also found in between the arachnoid and the pia mater. CSF cushions the brain, gives it buoyancy, buffers it from trauma, nourishes it, and removes waste products.
So, those are the many defenses the brain has for protection: the skull, the 3 meningeal layers, and CSF. Thank heavens for them. And that about wraps it up for the brain.
For those of you who want to study the electrical activity of the brain, why not try electroencephalography, or EEG? This is the tool doctors use to measure the electrical activity of brain waves. It's usually used to study sleeping disorders and epilepsy, but you can use it to explore the brain in the privacy and comfort of your own home.
Really?
No, probably not.
Even the bravest of soldiers fear a traumatic brain injury. These horrible injuries are the result of a direct blow or when the brain ricochets against the skull. There are 2 common types of brain injuries: concussions and contusions.
Concussions involve minor damage to brain tissue that doesn't result in permanent damage, but can cause dizziness.
Contusions involve tissue destruction and can cause permanent neurological damage. So let this be a lesson. Wear your Army helmet at all times.
You should also be aware of a number of degenerative brain diseases, which are long-term disturbances in brain structure and brain function. 2 serious degenerative brain diseases are cerebrovascular accidents and Alzheimer's disease.
Cerebrovascular accident is another word for stroke, or when a circulation blockage causes a lack of blood to the brain. This results in a condition called ischemia. Ischemia eventually results in the death of brain tissue.
Alzheimer's disease results in dementia, a breakdown of mental processing. This is a progressive degenerative brain disease, which means it gets worse over time. Tragically enough, the effects of brain diseases are irreversible because the neurons that make up the brain do not regenerate.
So now that the brain is our close and personal friend, we need to move on to the second section of the central nervous system, the spinal cord. The spinal cord connects the brain to the peripheral nervous system. It's also a major reflex center. This means it's responsible for reflex action, which is rapid response to any kind of stimulus. We'll go into more detail on this later.
The spinal cord is roughly 17 inches long and stretches from the large opening at the base of the skull, called the foramen magnum, all the way down to the first lumbar vertebra.
A number of spinal nerves extend out from the spinal cord, but we'll go into details on those later on.
Just like the brain, the spinal cord has a bony covering to protect it. This covering is the vertebral column, which, if you've been paying attention, you know is part of the axial skeleton. The spinal cord, just like the brain, is also protected by the cerebrospinal fluid and the meninges.
The spinal cord is also protected by the same 3 meningeal layers of the brain.
the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The one exception is that the dura mater of the spinal cord is only single-layered and is called the dural sheath. So just remember that the dural sheath is different from the dura mater because it's single-layered rather than double-layered.
Some amusing and entertaining features of the spinal cord are the conus medullaris, the filum terminale, the denticulate ligaments, the cervical and lumbar enlargements, and the cauda equina.
The conus medullaris is the most inferior, tapered end of the spinal cord. The filum terminale is an extension of the pia mater that anchors the cord to the coccyx. The denticulate ligaments attach the spinal cord to the vertebral column. The cervical and lumbar enlargements are areas of the spinal cord that are wider than the normal diameter. The spinal nerves coming out of the cervical enlargement serve the upper limbs, and the spinal nerves coming out of the lumbar enlargement serve the lower limbs. Finally, the cauda equina, or horse's tail, is a group of nerve roots at the end of the spinal cord radiating out of the conus medullaris.
So that's the long and short of the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, and a whole lot of worries. Knowing this, you should feel confident about moving on to study the peripheral nervous system, or PNS.
Section C, the peripheral nervous system. Like we said before, the peripheral nervous system's main job is to link the body to the central nervous system. It accomplishes this job using two subdivisions, the sensory, or afferent division, and the motor, or efferent division. We'll start with the sensory division.
The sensory division has to do with your senses. That's how it got its name. Its job is to detect stimuli, you know, stuff like pain and pressure, temperature and smell. After it does this, it transmits an impulse to the CNS, where the impulse is processed. The division contains 5 receptor types, which are classified by the type of stimuli they detect. These receptors are the mechanoreceptors, the thermoreceptors, the photoreceptors, the chemoreceptors, and the nociceptors.
The mechanoreceptors detect mechanical changes like touch, pressure, vibrations, and stretch. Mechanical changes usually involve some kind of physical stimulus. When you hear mechano, think mechanical.
Thermoreceptors detect changes in temperature. This is easy to remember because thermo sounds like thermometer.
Photoreceptors are responsible for detecting changes in light. Photo is another word for light, so you shouldn't have any problem memorizing this either.
Chemoreceptors detect soluble chemicals. When you hear chemo, think chemicals.
And finally, nociceptors are specialized to detect physical pain.
Now, it's important to note that your special senses are different from your general senses. Your special senses, vision and hearing, utilize really complex receptors that are housed in your sense organs. You know, your eyes and ears. We'll describe those in a little bit. But for now, concentrate on the general senses of the sensory division that we just discussed. These senses use things called reflex arcs to produce rapid programmed responses to stimuli. Confused? We'll explain.
Every reflex arc has 5 components: a receptor, a sensory neuron, an integration center, a motor neuron, and an effector.
Receptors, which we've already talked about, detect stimuli.
A sensory neuron transmits an impulse to the central nervous system.
The integration center is located in the CNS and processes and interprets the stimuli.
The motor neuron transmits an impulse from the integration center to an effector organ.
And finally, the effector organ, usually a muscle, responds to the stimuli by contracting. Like when a hammer whacks your knee, the effector organs, the muscles around your knee, contract.
So that's how the reflex arc works for the sensory division of the PNS. And luckily for you, the motor division is just as fun and exciting.
The motor division transmits impulses from the CNS to the effector organs and causes those organs to respond. So whereas the sensory nervous system transmits impulses to the nervous system, the motor nervous system transmits impulses from the CNS. The motor division can be broken down into 2 subdivisions, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system.
The somatic nervous system is responsible for voluntary control of skeletal muscles. So, every time you give a Swedish massage, every time you pet a dog, every time you raise your hands to fight against evil, that's the work of the somatic nervous system.
The autonomic nervous system is in charge of the involuntary action of smooth and cardiac muscles. So the autonomic nervous system keeps tabs on involuntary regulation of organs, glands, and blood vessels. The autonomic nervous system can also be further broken down into two subdivisions, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. We'll talk about the sympathetic division first.
No, Big Joe, please. I just want to run and hide away in the forest with all the birds and trees and happy people.
Crazy! You're talking crazy! I just want to run and charge at the enemy and take a surface-to-air missile in the face.
Hello, I'm a doctor.
Oh, that means that you could help us if we get injured in battle.
Oh, no. I have no real medical training. I've just been hired to play a doctor because my voice sounds learned and reassuring. You see, what you boys are feeling right now are the effects of the sympathetic division of the nervous system. What? Big Joe, you want to jump out and fight in response to the terror of battle. And Harry, you want to run in fear. This is what's known as the fight or flight response.
How does he know our names?
The sympathetic nervous system generates the fight or flight response in the face of exciting, adverse, or threatening stimuli.
How does he make those little pictures appear?
Oh, take one of these.
What you're both feeling right now is an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and blood flow to muscles. You're also experiencing a decrease in digestion to divert blood from the rest of the body for use in skeletal muscles.
All this is done to prepare for swift and immediate action. That's the job of the sympathetic nervous system.
The other section of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic division.
So where were you out there? I didn't see you.
No, Sarge. I was out there. I was just, I'm quick and wily like a rabbit. I was doing more of my own thing. But I'm really happy to be here now, safe and warm with you. Safe and warm.
That's right, boys. Oh! Whoa! What you're feeling right now are the effects of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic division helps us rest and digest.
This division stimulates a gastrointestinal activity at a high level and also keeps heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate at normal resting levels. And that warm feeling you're probably feeling on your skin right now is due to the fact that blood is no longer being diverted to your skeletal muscles and can flow freely to other areas.
So, you can see the difference between the autonomic and somatic nervous divisions. The autonomic divisions control things you didn't even know needed controlling. So when you think autonomic, think autopilot. But there is one other key way in which the somatic nervous division differs from the autonomic nervous division. The somatic division uses only one neuron to link an effector organ to the central nervous system, while the autonomic division uses a two-neuron chain.
You see, in the somatic nervous system, the cell bodies of motor neurons are located in the central nervous system. Their axons, the little branches that extend from the cell body, well, these axons extend into spinal nerves and into the skeletal muscles they serve. So they use only one neuron per chain.
The autonomic nervous system uses two neurons. The first neuron in that chain is called a preganglionic neuron. The cell body of that neuron is found in the central nervous system, but the preganglionic neuron is connected to the second neuron by a preganglionic axon. The second neuron is called the postganglionic neuron. The cell body of the postganglionic neuron is located in a ganglion, which is a collection of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Then, the postganglionic neuron is connected to an effector organ by a postganglionic axon.
So that's another basic difference between the autonomic and somatic divisions of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. So let's take some time to retrace our steps through the peripheral nervous system.
The peripheral nervous system can first be broken down into the sensory division or motor division. Then the motor division can be further broken down into the autonomic and somatic divisions. Then the autonomic division can be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division.
And there you have it. But why stop there?
Because we're tired.
You're raring and ready to study actual nerve clusters found in all these different divisions of the peripheral nervous system.
An important cluster of nerves in the peripheral nervous system are the 12 cranial nerves and the 31 spinal nerves. Cranial nerves arise from the brain.
There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and with the exception of the vagus nerve, they all serve the head and neck area. These nerves are numbered in order from their location in the anterior of the brain to the posterior of the brain. In other words, from top to bottom. They can be separated into three groups: the sensory nerves, the motor nerves, and mixed pairs, which are groups of sensory and motor nerves. The sensory nerves are labeled 1, 2, and 8. The motor nerves are 4, 6, 11, and 12, and the mixed pairs, sensory and motor, are 3, 5, 7, 9, and 10.
Welcome to Cranial Nerve Countdown, where we give you the cranial nerves in descending order. So, in descending order, here we go. At the top of the charts is cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. This sensory nerve is responsible for smell. Next up is cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. This is the sensory nerve that makes vision possible. Making its debut at number 3 is cranial nerve number 3, the ocular motor nerve. Then at number 4, the trochlear motor nerve. Both of these nerves are responsible for movement of the eyes. 2 weeks at number 5 is cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve. It's the largest cranial nerve and is responsible for sensation in the face and the muscles that help us chew. The abducens is cranial nerve number 6. This motor nerve is responsible for right to left and left to right eye movement. Nerve number 7, the facial nerve, is dedicated to Bobby and Juanita. The facial nerve is responsible for facial expressions and the secretion of saliva and tears. So don't cry, Juanita. Bobby loves you. This nerve is grouped with the mixed pairs. Next on the charts is cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear. This sensory nerve is in charge of equilibrium or balance and hearing. The glossopharyngeal nerve is number 9. It's responsible for swallowing and taste. The vagus nerve, number 10, is responsible for slot machine regulation. No, just kidding. The vagus nerve is actually involved in the regulation of heart rate, respiration, and digestion. It's even responsible for the muscles in the voice box. The vagus nerve is the only cranial nerve to pass beyond the head and neck and into the thoracic and abdominal cavities. That's quite a nerve. Cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve. This motor nerve is responsible for head and neck movement and has won 4 Grammys this year alone. The hypoglossal nerve is cranial nerve number 12. It's found hiding underneath the tongue and helps us speak and swallow. And that's it for Cranial Nerve Countdown. Until next time, keep your nerves on the ground and keep reaching for the rewind button.
Another area of the nervous system that's jam-packed with nerves is the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of nerves in the spinal cord that serve the body below the head and the neck. All spinal nerves are identified by the place they originate from along the spinal cord.
Altogether, the spinal nerves consist of 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, 5 sacral nerves, and 1 coccygeal nerve.
And that brings us to the end of our little nervous system tete-a-tete. I hope you remember everything about the central and peripheral nervous systems, as well as their respective subdivisions. And if you find all this information to be a little hazy, just rewind